The final entry in the Tessic archive of cartographic record was not written by the archivist who maintained it. Drenal Sorvan knew this because he was the archivist who maintained it, and the handwriting on the last page of the physical ledger, the ceremonial duplicate that the Tessic kept alongside their digital records, a tradition dating back to the founding of the archive 11,000 years before, was not his. It resembled his. The angle of the glyphs, the pressure patterns, the small idiosyncrasy he had developed over 40 years of transcription, where the tail of the consonant marker curved left instead of right, all of it was present. But the thought behind the glyphs was wrong. The entry described an event that had not occurred. A survey fleet returning from the Forbidden Sector with data intact, crew unharmed, findings catalogued and indexed under standard classification. Routine, unremarkable, the kind of entry that should have closed a survey cycle and opened the next. Except no survey fleet had returned from the Forbidden Sector in 400 years. Sorvan stood at his transcription desk in the lower vault of the archive, the great stone chamber stretching away from him in every direction, shelves climbing toward a ceiling lost in shadow. The air carried the dry, mineral smell of preservation compounds and old binding adhesive. His desk lamp, a single focused beam of amber light in the vast dark, illuminated the open ledger and his own hands, and nothing else. The rest of the archive existed as suggestion. The faint geometry of shelf edges, the distant click of climate regulation mechanisms, the occasional soft groan of the building's ancient thermal expansion joints settling in the cold of the planet's long night. He had been the senior archivist of the Tessic cartographic record for 23 years. Before that, he had been a junior transcriptionist for 17. Before that, a student at the Tessic Academy of Navigational Sciences, where he had learned, as every Tessic student learned, as a condition of graduation, that certain sectors of the galaxy were not to be charted, not to be approached, and not to be discussed in terms that suggested anything other than their permanent, settled emptiness. The Forbidden Sector was the largest of these. It occupied a volume of space that, if it had contained active civilizations, would have represented approximately 11% of the galaxy's habitable zone. It did not contain active civilizations. The Tessic charts showed it as a gray expanse with no navigational markers, no trade corridors, no beacon networks, no station designations, nothing but a uniform field of gray interrupted at its borders by the small, precise glyph that every Tessic navigator learned to recognize before they learned anything else. The warning seal of the Archival Council, indicating that the information beyond this point had been classified as permanently withheld. Sorvan had never questioned the gray. He was an archivist, not a philosopher. His function was to maintain the record, to transcribe the day's navigational updates from digital to physical, to preserve the ceremonial continuity of a tradition older than most civilizations, to ensure that what was recorded was accurate, complete, and consistent with what had been recorded before. The gray sectors were gray because they had always been gray. That was sufficient. Until tonight, when the ledger had written itself. He turned the pages back, counting. The false entry, the fabricated return of a survey fleet that did not exist, was on page 11,412. The entry before it, on page 11,411, was his own. A routine update of beacon calibrations along the Tessic-Drenathi trade corridor, dated that morning, in his actual handwriting, recording an actual event. Everything was normal up to that point. And then, between his entry and the next blank page, something had written a fiction. Sorvan checked the ink. He leaned close to the page, close enough that the amber lamplight caught the surface at a shallow angle and revealed the slight depression that a stylus leaves in preservation-grade paper. The depression was there, faint, consistent, the marks of a physical instrument pressed against a physical surface with physical force. This was not a projection, not a digital artifact bleeding through from the crystal lattice index. Something had held a stylus. Something had pressed it to this page. Something had formed these glyphs with a hand, or something that functioned like a hand in this room, at this desk, within the last 12 hours. Sorvan had been the only person in the lower vault since the day shift ended. His species processed fear differently than most. The Tessic were a long-lived, methodical people, slender, gray-skinned, with elongated skulls that housed a neural architecture optimized for pattern recognition and sequential analysis. They did not startle. They did not panic. When a Tessic encountered something that did not fit the established pattern, the response was not adrenaline but a deep, systematic discomfort that manifested as a need to re-examine the data, to go back to the beginning and trace the sequence forward until the anomaly resolved. Sorvan went back to the beginning. He started with the oldest ledger in the archive volume, one of the Tessic cartographic record, housed in a climate-sealed vault 3 levels below his desk, in a chamber that required 2 keystone authorizations and a biometric scan to enter. He had entered it perhaps a dozen times in his career. The chamber was small, cold, and lit by a single overhead fixture that cast a pale blue light designed to minimize photonic degradation of the ancient binding materials. Volume 1 sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, enclosed in a transparent preservation field that allowed the pages to be read but not touched. He read the first entry. It was dated 11,007 years before the present, in the archaic Tessic script that predated the modern glyph set by 3 phonemic shifts. He could read it, barely. Every senior archivist was trained in archaic transcription. The entry described the founding of the archive, the appointment of the first cartographic council, and the initial survey of the galaxy's navigable sectors. It listed, with the meticulous precision that would define Tessic record-keeping for the next 11 millennia, every sector that the founding surveyors had identified, classified, and assigned a navigational designation. Every sector, including the ones that were now gray. Sorvan read the entry 3 times. The discomfort in his neural architecture shifted from a background hum to a focused, directed pressure, the cognitive equivalent of a lens grinding into focus on something that should not be there. The founding survey had charted those sectors, had named them, had assigned them navigational designations and recorded the results with the same care and specificity as every other sector in the galaxy. They were not gray. They were not withheld. They were present, documented, ordinary. He read the entries that followed the daily, weekly, monthly accumulation of survey data that traced the Tessic's expanding knowledge of the galaxy's geography. He read for hours, moving from page to page, volume to volume, following the record forward through time. The sealed vault contained the first 200 volumes. The rest were housed in the main archive above, organized in sequential vaults that Sorvan could navigate with his eyes closed. What he found made the discomfort deepen into something he did not have a word for. The sectors now designated as the Forbidden Zone had not always been gray. In the early volumes, volumes 1 through approximately 400, spanning the first 3,000 years of the record, they were charted, fully, with the same detail, the same precision, the same navigational markers and trade corridors and beacon networks as every other sector of the galaxy. The entries described civilizations, trade agreements, cultural exchanges, scientific collaborations. Species whose names Sorvan did not recognize, the Velori, the Corvinthi, the Moth-Selin, the Dreth Compact, were listed as active participants in a galactic community that included those sectors as unremarkable members. The Velori had maintained a cultural exchange with the Tessic for 800 years. The Corvinthi had contributed to the archive's early navigational surveys. The Moth-Selin had a diplomatic seat on the Tessic Cartographic Council. These were not obscure, peripheral cultures. They were core members of the galactic community. They had helped build the record. Their contributions were documented in detail across hundreds of volumes. And then, beginning approximately 7,000 years ago, the entries changed. Not all at once. The change was gradual, so gradual that Sorvan, reading forward through the volumes, almost missed the moment it began. A navigation update that omitted a beacon that had been listed in the previous entry. A trade corridor that appeared in 1 month's record and vanished from the next without explanation. A species name that was mentioned in a diplomatic summary and then never appeared again. Small deletions. Tiny absences. The kind of discrepancies that, in 11,000 years of accumulated data, could be dismissed as transcription errors, outdated references, routine updates to a living document. But they were not routine, they were systematic. Sorvan pulled volume after volume from the shelves, working through the night, his desk lamp the only light in the vast dark of the archive. He cross-referenced entries, compared navigational grids, tracked the appearance and disappearance of every designation in the sectors that were now forbidden. He built a timeline on a spare sheet of notepaper dates of deletion, organized by species and sector, mapped against the tenures of the archivists who had been serving at the time. The pattern was unmistakable once he knew what to look for, a slow, steady, methodical erasure. Over a period of approximately 2,000 years, from roughly 7,000 to roughly 5,000 years before the present, the sectors that would become the forbidden zone were emptied from the record. Not redacted, not classified, not marked with the warning seal and filed under restricted access. Emptied, as if the information had never existed. As if the civilizations that had lived there, traded there, built beacon networks and charted routes, and exchanged cultural data with their neighbors for 3,000 years, had simply ceased to be. The Vilari were the first to go. Their designation appeared in volume 389 and was absent from volume 390. 800 years of cultural exchange with the Tessic, erased in the gap between 2 quarterly updates. The Corvinthi lasted longer. Their name persisted for another 300 years, appearing with decreasing frequency, mentioned in fewer entries each cycle, until it appeared for the last time in volume 412 as a footnote in a trade route status report, and then vanished entirely. The Moth-Selen and the Dreth Compact went together, disappearing from the record within the same 50-year window, their combined history of galactic participation reduced to nothing in the span of a single archivist's career. The gray was not an absence. It was a burial. Sorvan sat back in his chair and stared at the open volume spread across his desk. His hands were trembling not from fear, not from cold, but from the sustained cognitive effort of processing a pattern that contradicted everything he had been trained to believe about the archive he maintained. The Tessic cartographic record was the most complete, most meticulously maintained navigational document in the known galaxy. It was the foundation on which every species' star charts were built. The Tessic did not erase, the Tessic did not fabricate, the Tessic recorded, preserved, and maintained. That was the function, that was the identity. And yet something had edited the record, over 2,000 years. With a patience and precision that matched or exceeded the Tessic's own standards of archival care. He reached for the next volume in the sequence, volume 417, covering a period approximately 6,800 years before the present, and opened it to the section dealing with the border sectors. The pages were yellowed but intact, the glyphs clear, the binding solid. He read the navigation update for the date in question, a routine adjustment to the beacon network along the border of what was then called the Tarvani Corridor, a busy trade route connecting the Tessic administrative zone to the Corvinthi exchange. The update was normal, routine, except for one detail. The handwriting was not the original archivist's. Sorvan recognized it because he recognized all handwriting. It was his function, his talent, the skill that had made him senior archivist. Every transcriptionist left traces, pressure patterns, glyph angles, the speed and rhythm of their hand. Volume 417 had been transcribed by an archivist named Pelon Save, whose records Sorvan had studied as part of his training. Pelansave's handwriting was distinctive, precise, angular, with a characteristic upward sweep on the terminal glyphs that no other Tessic transcriptionist had replicated. The navigation update on this page was in Pelansave's hand. The entry that followed it, a brief notation about the status of a diplomatic exchange with the Corvinthi, was not. It was a perfect imitation. The glyphs were the right shape. The pressure was the right depth. The terminal sweeps were present, but the rhythm was wrong. The spacing between words was fractionally too even, mechanically even, as if produced by something that understood the visual pattern of Pelansave's handwriting but not the neurological rhythm that produced it. Someone had forged entries in the archive, not recently, 6,800 years ago. Sorvan began checking other volumes. Randomly at first, then systematically, pulling ledgers from across the 2,000-year window of the erasure, and examining the handwriting of every entry that dealt with the border sectors. Volume 431, a forged trade route amendment in the hand of Archivist Dremen Cole, with the same mechanical spacing. Volume 458, a forged species census update in the hand of Archivist Tesson Vren, the characteristic tremor in her terminal strokes replicated but the pressure depth wrong by a fraction of a millimeter, too consistent, too controlled, lacking the slight variation that a living hand produces. Volume 490, a forged beacon deletion notice in the hand of Archivist Corvin Plays, perfect in every detail except that Corvin Plays had died 3 years before the entry's date. The dead archivist's handwriting was the clearest proof. Whoever had forged that entry had not known that Plays was dead at the time of the forgery, or had known and had not cared, because the discrepancy was buried so deep in the record that no one would cross-reference a routine beacon deletion against a personnel file from 3 years earlier. Not in 11,000 years. Not unless someone was looking for exactly this pattern. The forgeries did not add information. They removed it. They replaced entries that had contained navigational data, trade records, species designations, and cultural references with entries that contained slightly less. A beacon deleted, a trade route shortened, a species name replaced with a generic designation that carried no specificity. Each forgery was a tiny subtraction, a fractional narrowing of the record's scope, and over 2,000 years of fractional narrowing, the sectors had been emptied. Not by the Tessic, by something else, something that had access to the archive, physical access to the actual ledgers in the actual vaults, and the patience to edit them one entry at a time over 2 millennia. Sorvan closed volume 490 and sat in the silence of the archive. The climate regulation systems hummed. The thermal expansion joints groaned. The amber light of his desk lamp pooled on the closed ledger and the surface of his desk and went no further. He pulled the digital index, the parallel record that the Tessic maintained alongside the physical ledgers, stored on crystal lattice data cores in a separate wing of the building. The index was supposed to be an exact mirror of the physical record. Every entry in the ledgers had a corresponding digital entry, verified quarterly by the transcription staff. The digital index showed the forbidden sector as gray, empty, permanently withheld, the same as the physical ledgers showed now. But the digital index had a feature the physical ledgers did not: version history. Every modification to a digital entry was logged, time-stamped, and attributed to an operator. Sorvan accessed the version history for the border sector entries and scrolled through 7,000 years of modifications. The modifications were there. Thousands of them. Small changes spread across centuries, each one removing a data point, shortening a corridor designation, replacing a species name with a null marker. The version history recorded every edit faithfully. Every edit was attributed to the senior archivist on duty at the time of the change. Sorvan read the operator names: Pelansave, Tormeth Kale, Risson Ve, Drenna Sarath. Corvin Plays listed as the operator on 12 separate edits made after his death. names he knew from the personnel archive, from the lineage of archivists he had studied as a student, from the carved memorial wall in the archive's entrance hall where every senior archivist's name was inscribed upon retirement or death. The edits were attributed to real archivists, made during their real tenures, or after their deaths, logged with their real credentials. But Sorvan had just proven, through handwriting analysis of the physical ledgers, that those archivists had not made those edits. Someone else had made them in the archivist's names, with the archivist's credentials, using the archivist's handwriting. Someone who could access both the physical ledgers and the digital index. Someone who could forge credentials as easily as handwriting. The TESIC security protocols for the archive were the most rigorous in the galaxy. Biometric authorization, keystone verification, continuous environmental monitoring, motion-triggered lighting in every vault, climate-sealed doors that logged every opening and closing. No unauthorized individual had entered the archive in 11,000 years of recorded history, which meant the thing that was editing the record was not unauthorized. It was inside the security perimeter. It had always been inside the security perimeter. Sorvan pulled the environmental logs for the archive, the continuous record of temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition, vibration, and motion that the building's monitoring systems maintained. He scrolled to tonight's readings, looking for the time window during which the false entry had appeared in the current ledger. The environmental logs showed nothing unusual. Temperature, nominal, humidity within preservation parameters, atmospheric composition, standard. Motion sensors, one individual present in the lower vault. Sorvan himself, no additional motion detected. He widened the search. He pulled environmental logs from across the erasure window, random samples from different centuries, different vaults, different times of night when the forged entries would have been made. Every log showed the same thing. Normal parameters, no unauthorized motion, no anomalous readings. 11,000 years of environmental monitoring, and not a single recorded instance of anything unusual. Either the monitoring systems had failed to detect the intruder, or the monitoring systems themselves had been edited. Sorvan checked. He ran a diagnostic on the environmental monitoring array, a deep-level system check that examined not just the current readings but the integrity of the monitoring software itself, the calibration history of the sensors, the chain of custody for the data. The diagnostic returned clean, every sensor calibrated, every data chain intact, every reading verified against hardware standards. The diagnostic was part of the record. It was subject to the same editing. Sorvan stood and walked to the far end of the archive, past the stacked volumes of 7 millennia, past the sealed climate vaults and the restricted access chambers, past the transcription stations where junior archivists worked during the day shifts, past the empty desks and the dark reading lamps and the silent shelves. He walked until he reached the wall. The back wall of the archive, a massive slab of gray stone, undecorated, unmarked, the original foundation material of the building that had housed the record since its founding. He placed his hand on the stone. It was cold. The temperature of the planet's bedrock, unmediated by the archive's climate systems. He pressed his palm flat against it and felt the solidity, the permanence, the 11,000-year weight of the institution he served. Then he felt something else. A vibration. Faint. So faint that he would not have noticed it if his hand had not been pressed flat, if the archive had not been silent, if his neural architecture had not been running at the heightened sensitivity that sustained cognitive effort produced in a TESIC brain. A vibration in the stone wall, regular, rhythmic, pulsing at a frequency that his body recognized before his mind could classify it. A heartbeat. Not his. The rhythm was wrong, slower than a TESIC cardiac cycle, deeper, with a harmonic undertone that no biological heart produced. But it was a heartbeat. Something on the other side of the wall or inside the wall or underneath the building was alive, and it was beating. Sorvan pressed harder. The vibration clarified. Not one heartbeat, several, layered, overlapping at different depths within the stone, as if the wall contained not a single organism but a network of them, distributed through the foundation the way the climatregulation conduits were distributed through the ceiling, separate but coordinated. Each pulse slightly offset from the others, producing a composite rhythm that the stone transmitted upward through the floor, through the desk legs, through the chair, through every surface Sorvan had touched for 23 years without recognizing what he was feeling. He moved along the wall, keeping his palm pressed flat, and the heartbeat followed him. The same rhythm at every point, not emanating from a single source behind the wall, emanating from within the wall itself. The stone was not merely transmitting the vibration. The stone was the medium in which the vibration lived. Whatever was producing the heartbeat was not behind the wall. It was the wall, or it had grown into the wall so thoroughly that the distinction had ceased to matter. Sorvan knelt and pressed his hand to the floor. The same heartbeat. He stood and reached as high as he could, pressing his palm to the stone above the door frame of the nearest vault. The same heartbeat. Walls, floor, ceiling, the entire structure pulsed with the same composite rhythm, steady and unhurried, the biological clock of something that had been alive for a very long time and intended to remain alive for longer. He had been sitting on a heartbeat, working on a heartbeat. The slight, persistent vibration that he had always attributed to the building's mechanical systems, the hum he had learned to ignore in his first week as a junior transcriptionist, was not mechanical. It was biological. Sorvan pulled his hand away and stood very still. He went to the maintenance storage compartment at the end of the lower vault, a narrow alcove where cleaning supplies, repair tools, and spare parts for the climatregulation system were kept. He found a geological sampling kit, the kind used for routine foundation inspections. It contained a small hand drill, a specimen tray, and a magnification loupe. The kit had not been used in 6 years. Its last recorded use was a standard foundation survey conducted during the tenure of his predecessor, which had returned unremarkable results. Sorvan carried the kit to the back wall. He selected a point at chest height, positioned the hand drill against the stone, and began to bore. The stone resisted the way stone should: mineral density, crystalline grain structure, the familiar resistance of the planet's native basalt. He drilled slowly, carefully, the way a surgeon cuts. Controlled pressure, steady rotation, attention to what the material was telling him through the resistance patterns transmitted up the drill shaft. At 4 centimeters of depth, the resistance changed. The drill did not break through into a void. It did not encounter a different mineral. It encountered something softer, something that yielded with a different quality than stone, not the brittle fracture of mineral, but the slow, elastic give of organic material under compression. The drill advanced 0.5 centimeter and then stopped, not because it had hit something harder but because something was gripping it. The rotation slowed. The shaft twisted in his hand. Something in the stone was holding the drill bit the way a muscle holds a thorn, not resisting, not pulling, just holding, refusing to let the foreign object advance further without acknowledgement. Sorvan withdrew the drill. The bit came free with a faint sucking sound that had no business existing in a core sample of basalt. He held the drill up to the amber light of his desk lamp and examined the bit through the magnification loupe. The steel was coated with a thin film of material that was not stone dust. It was organic, a translucent, pale substance with a faintly fibrous internal structure, like the cross-section of a tendon viewed under magnification. It caught the amber light and held it, refracting it into a warm glow that made the substance look almost luminous. When Sorvan touched it with his fingertip, it was warm. Not room temperature, not stone temperature, body temperature, the temperature of something alive. He examined the bore hole in the wall. At its base, 4 centimeters in, the stone transitioned to something else. The transition was not sharp, there was no clear boundary between basalt and whatever the organic material was. The stone darkened gradually, becoming denser, wetter, more textured, until it ceased to be stone and became tissue. Living tissue, woven into the mineral matrix of the wall so thoroughly that the two materials had become one substance, part rock, part organism, integrated at a level that suggested not a parasitic invasion, but a symbiotic merger that had been underway for millennia. The building was not infested. The building was inhabited, the way a shell is inhabited. The archive's stone walls were the outer casing of something that lived inside them, and the organism had been growing into the walls, or the walls had been growing around the organism, for so long that neither could be separated from the other without destroying both. Sorvan placed the drill bit in the specimen tray and sealed it. He returned to the bore hole and watched it. Within 30 seconds, the organic material at the base of the hole began to swell, slowly filling the void the drill had created. Within 2 minutes, the bore hole was sealed not with stone, not with mortar, but with a smooth plug of the same organic tissue, its surface hardening as it was exposed to the archive's climate-controlled atmosphere, darkening to match the color of the surrounding basalt. In 5 minutes, the wall looked untouched. No bore hole, no evidence, as if he had never drilled. The wall had healed itself. Sorvan carried the specimen tray to his desk and set it beside the open ledger. The organic sample on the drill bit was already changing, drying in the archive's low-humidity environment, its translucent quality fading to an opaque gray that was indistinguishable from stone dust. By morning, it would look like mineral residue. The evidence was curating itself, the same way the record curated itself, the same way the communications curated themselves. Everything in this building was subject to the same editorial process. He opened the archive's construction records, a section of the administrative files that documented the building's original specifications, engineering surveys, renovation histories, and structural assessments. The construction records stated that the archive had been built 11,012 years ago by the first cartographic council on the foundation of a natural basalt formation chosen for its geological stability and thermal inertia. The foundation had been surveyed prior to construction and found to be uniform basalt to a depth of 90 meters. Sorvan read the survey report with new eyes. The geological survey had been conducted by a team of TESIC engineers whose names appeared in the personnel archive. The survey methodology was standard. The results were standard. The foundation was basalt, nothing unusual. But the survey report was part of the record, and the record could be edited. Sorvan pulled the architectural blueprints for the building, the original engineering drawings, preserved in a separate climate vault under their own classification. He studied the foundation diagrams. The blueprints showed a standard basalt foundation, extending 90 meters below the archive's lowest level. The foundation was drawn as a uniform block of native stone, surveyed and certified by the original engineering team. The architectural blueprints were physical documents. They were subject to the same editorial control as the ledgers, and the blueprints showed something that Sorvan's drill had just disproven, that the foundation was uniform basalt. It was not. 4 centimeters into the back wall, the basalt became tissue. The blueprints were wrong. Or the blueprints were right, and the foundation had been uniform basalt 11,000 years ago, and something had grown into it since then. Something that had entered the stone and merged with it over millennia, the way tree roots merge with the soil they grow through slowly, patiently, transforming the medium without destroying it, until the organism and the substrate were one thing. Sorvan thought about timelines. The forgeries in the record began approximately 7,000 years ago. The building was 11,000 years old. If the organism had entered the foundation at the same time the forgeries began, it had been growing into the stone for 7,000 years, approximately 60% of the building's total existence, more than half the archive's lifespan. The organism was not a recent intruder. It was a permanent resident that had occupied the building for longer than most civilizations had existed. He thought about what 7,000 years of growth meant. The organism was in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It had reached the desk surface. He could feel the heartbeat through the wood. It had reached the shelving. The shelves were anchored to the walls, and the walls were tissue. It had reached the ledgers themselves. The paper sat on shelves that were anchored to tissue, stored in vaults made of tissue, maintained by climate regulation systems that ran through conduits embedded in tissue. Every physical component of the archive was in contact with the organism. Every surface Sorvan touched was a surface the organism also touched. The archive was not a building that contained an intruder. The archive was an organ of something larger, a specialized structure, the way a liver is a specialized structure within a body, performing a specific function for the organism as a whole. The archive's function was to maintain the record, and the organism's function was to determine what the record said. Sorvan returned to his desk. He sat down. He looked at the specimen tray. The organic sample had finished its transformation, gray, dry, indistinguishable from stone dust. Even the physical evidence was editing itself. The organism did not need to send agents to destroy the sample. The sample was part of the organism. It was returning to its default state. He opened the current ledger to the next blank page. He picked up his transcription stylus, and he began to write. He wrote what he had found, the genuine entries, the forgeries, the 2,000-year erasure, the dead archivist whose handwriting appeared on entries made after his death, the systematic emptying of 11% of the galaxy from the historical record, the heartbeat in the walls. He wrote it all in his own hand, with the full precision and methodological rigor of a senior archivist documenting an anomaly in the record. He filled 6 pages. When he finished, he set the stylus down and read what he had written from the beginning. It was gone. Not erased, not scratched out, not overwritten. The pages were blank, clean. As if he had never touched them. The ink was not smeared, not faded, not removed. It had simply ceased to exist on the page. 6 pages of detailed, precise documentation, written in real time in his own hand, recording his own observations, vanished. Sorvan stared at the blank pages. He wrote it again, faster this time. He watched the stylus move across the page, watched the ink flow from the tip, watched the glyphs form under his hand. He completed 1 sentence. Then he watched the glyphs fade. Not slowly, not gradually, they simply became less present, as if the page were absorbing them, drawing them down into the fiber of the paper the way stone absorbs water. Within seconds, the page was blank again. The archive was not allowing him to record what he had found. Sorvan tried the digital index. He sat at the crystal lattice interface beside his desk and typed the same findings. The characters appeared on the display, clear and precise. He saved the entry. The system confirmed the save. He closed the file and reopened it. The file was empty. He checked the version history. It showed no modifications, no saves, no entries, as if he had never opened the interface. Sorvan tried a different medium. He walked to the junior transcriptionist station 3 desks away, where a different ledger, a secondary record used for internal notes and cross-reference logs, was open on the desk. He picked up the stylus there and wrote quickly a single line. The record is not ours. He watched the page, the glyphs held for 1 second, 2, 3. Then they began to thin, to pale, to sink into the paper with the same silent absorption, but slower. The secondary ledger resisted longer than the primary. As if the thing editing the archive had priorities: the primary record first, the secondary logs second, the peripheral documents third. A hierarchy of control applied with methodical patience. The line vanished. Sorvan tried a peripheral document. He found a blank sheet of preservation-grade paper in the supply closet and carried it back to his desk. He wrote, "The walls of this building contain a living presence that has been editing the Tessic cartographic record for approximately 7,000 years. The ink held for 11 seconds, he counted. Then it faded from the edges inward, the paper metabolizing the ink like living tissue absorbing a foreign substance. Blank in under 20 seconds. He tried non-archival paper, a scrap of inventory packaging from the supply closet, rough-textured, not preservation grade. He wrote the same sentence. The ink held for 31 seconds. Longer. The thing in the walls had less control over non-standard materials. Its influence was calibrated to the archive's own surfaces, its own paper, its own media. The further a medium was from the official record, the slower the erasure. But it still erased. Sorvan set the blank scrap aside and returned to his desk. He opened the personnel archive, a separate collection, housed in a different vault, recording the service histories of every archivist who had ever worked in the building. He pulled the records of his predecessors, one by one. 3 of them had no retirement date, no end-of-service evaluation, no record of departure. Their entries simply stopped. Senior Archivist Kellan Voth, who had served 6,300 years ago during the window of the erasure. Service record, 41 years. Final entry, a routine transcription update, half completed, the last glyph trailing off as if the hand that held the stylus had simply stopped moving. Sorvan pulled volume 392, which covered the period of Kellan Voth's tenure. He found the section corresponding to the final weeks of Voth's service and examined the handwriting. The last entries attributed to Voth were genuine, but in the margins of one page, barely visible, written in glyphs so small they could have been mistaken for preservation artifacts, Sorvan found 4 words in Voth's hand. "They are beneath us." The marginal note had survived. 6,300 years in miniature script, tucked into the binding gutter where the pages met the spine. The thing in the walls had either missed it or considered it too peripheral to prioritize. Senior Archivist Rune Talus, 4,800 years ago. Service record, 37 years. Final entry, a note in the margins of a cross-reference log that read, "The volumes do not match. I am going to the Foundation vault too." The sentence ended there. No period, no continuation, no further entries by Rune Talus for a gap of 14 months, after which a new archivist resumed the record under emergency protocols. Sorvan went to the cross-reference log from Talus's era in Vault 7. He turned to the pages from Talus's final months and found a series of annotations in Talus's hand. Not a narrative. A series of paired page numbers, entries in the official record that Talus had flagged as discrepant. A systematic catalog of forgeries covering a 1,000-year segment of the erasure window. Talus had mapped the progression, the rate of replacement, the sequence of species name deletions, the order in which corridors were shortened and beacons removed. The annotations ended on the same page as Talus's final note. Talus had gone to the Foundation. Talus had not come back, and when Sorvan examined the cross-reference log more closely, he noticed something Talus could not have noticed. 3 of the annotations had been altered. Not deleted, altered. The paired page numbers had been changed, redirecting anyone who followed Talus's research to entries that contained no discrepancies. Someone had edited Talus's private research notes, the personal annotations of a senior archivist, to make the trail lead nowhere. Senior Archivist Marin Dreth, 2,200 years ago. Service record, 53 years, the longest of any senior archivist in the record. Final entry, a single line in the personnel archive, in handwriting that Sorvan recognized as Marin Dreth's own. "It is not hostile, it is patient. It waits for each of us to notice, and then it waits for each of us to understand. I understand now. The record was never ours." Marin Dreth's service ended without ceremony, without explanation, without the appointment of a successor for 11 months. The gap during those 11 months was the longest unbroken silence in the archive's history. 11 months during which no entries were made, no updates transcribed, no navigational amendments filed. 11 months of nothing. Sorvan wondered what had happened during those 11 months, whether Dreth had remained in the building, whether the thing in the walls had continued its work without a Tessic archivist present, or whether it had paused, waited, as Dreth said it waited for the next archivist to arrive and begin the cycle again. He wondered whether Dreth had tried to leave. He walked to the archive's communication terminal, a secure channel connected to the Tessic administrative network, used for transmitting daily updates and receiving navigational data from the fleet. He opened a new message, addressed to the Archival Council, and typed, "Anomaly detected in the cartographic record. Request immediate inspection of Foundation Vault and environmental monitoring infrastructure. Priority level, critical." He sent the message. The system confirmed transmission. The message appeared in the sent log with a timestamp and a delivery confirmation. Sorvan opened the sent log to verify. The message was there, but its content had changed. It now read, "Routine maintenance request. Climate regulation conduit in Vault 7 requires recalibration. Priority level, standard." The thing in the walls had edited his outgoing communication. In real time, between the moment of transmission and the moment he checked the sent log, a span of perhaps 4 seconds, the content of his message had been rewritten. Not deleted, rewritten. Replaced with something plausible, something routine, something that would not trigger a response from the Archival Council beyond a standard maintenance authorization. Sorvan sent another message. He watched the screen as he typed, watched the characters form, watched the send confirmation appear. He opened the sent log immediately. "Routine maintenance request. Climate regulation conduit in Vault 7 requires recalibration. Priority level, standard." The same message, word for word. Regardless of what he typed, the system transmitted the same routine maintenance request. The communication channel was not broken. It was curated. The thing in the walls was not blocking his messages, it was replacing them, the same way it replaced entries in the record, with the same precision and the same patience. Sorvan closed the communication terminal. He sat in the amber light and processed what the 3 archivists before him had each learned by different paths. Voth through direct observation, they are beneath us. Talas through systematic analysis, the volumes do not match. Dreth through 53 years of coexistence, it is not hostile, it is patient, the record was never ours. And now Sorvan, through all 3 paths converging in a single night. The handwriting forgeries, the heartbeat in the walls, the entries that erased themselves, the communications that rewrote themselves, the dead archivist's credentials still active 3 years after his death, the organic tissue growing through the foundation stone. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. Sorvan made a decision. He stood, took his desk lamp, detaching it from its mounting with the quick, practiced motion of someone who had worked with the archive's hardware for decades, and walked to the stairwell that led down to the sub-vaults. Past the first sub-level, where the early volumes were stored. Past the second sub-level, where the administrative records and personnel archives occupied a series of narrow, climate-sealed chambers. Down to the third sub-level, the Foundation Vault. The level Rune Talas had been walking toward when his record stopped mid-sentence, 4,800 years ago. The Foundation Vault was the lowest point of the archive. Below it was supposed to be 90 meters of uniform basalt. The stairwell was narrow, carved from the same stone as the rest of the building, lit by emergency glow strips set into the walls at 2-meter intervals. The glow strips provided a cold blue-white light that turned Sorvan's gray skin to silver and made the walls look wet, though they were not. The air grew colder with each step. The climate regulation systems did not extend to the foundation level. The temperature down here was the temperature of the planet's crust, and the planet's crust was cold. The heartbeat grew stronger. By the time Sorvan reached the foundation vault's entrance, a heavy, stone-framed doorway sealed with a biometric lock and 2 keystone authorizations. The vibration in the walls was no longer something he had to press his hand flat to feel. He could feel it through his shoes, through the fabric of his archivist's coat, through the air itself, which carried the deepest harmonics of the composite pulse as a subsonic pressure that he felt in his chest cavity, in the hollow spaces behind his nasal ridge, in the fluid-filled inner ear structures that the Tessic used for spatial orientation. The building was louder down here, not with sound, with presence. The walls were closer, the ceiling lower, and the density of whatever lived inside the stone was greater. He could see it now, or thought he could. Faint variations in the surface of the stone, subtle differences in texture and color that he had never noticed on the occasions he had visited the foundation vault during daylight hours with the overhead fixtures at full brightness. In the sharp, directional light of his desk lamp, held at an angle that cast long shadows across the wall's surface, the stone showed a pattern, not carved, not painted, grown. A network of fine lines running through the basalt like the veins in a leaf branching, connecting, spreading outward in a geometry that was too regular to be geological and too organic to be architectural. The veins were darker than the surrounding stone. They absorbed the amber light of the desk lamp rather than reflecting it, creating a web of shadow that ran across the wall and disappeared into the floor and ceiling. When Sorvan held the lamp steady and watched, he thought he could see the veins pulse a faint expansion and contraction, timed to the heartbeat, as if the network was carrying something through the stone. Fluid, information, both. He opened the foundation vault. The biometric scanner read his palm print. The keystones turned. The door, a slab of stone 10 centimeters thick, hung on bearings that allowed it to swing despite its mass, opened inward with a low, resonant sound that was not quite a groan and not quite a note, but something between the two. As if the stone were speaking in a register his ears could detect but his language could not parse. The foundation vault was a single chamber, roughly circular, 10 meters in diameter. The ceiling was low. Sorvan, who was tall for a Tessic, had to lower his head slightly to avoid brushing the stone overhead. The room was bare except for the pedestal in the center where Volume 1 sat under its preservation field. There was no furniture, no shelving, no equipment. The room existed for one purpose: to house the first volume of the record in conditions of maximum preservation and minimum access. The floor of the foundation vault was different from the floor of the levels above. Sorvan noticed it immediately. The stone was the same basalt, the same color, the same mineral composition, but the surface was warm. Not body warm, as the material from his drill sample had been. Warmer. The temperature of a living organism running a metabolic process that generated heat as a byproduct. The floor radiated warmth upward through his shoes and into the bones of his feet. The veins in the walls were denser here. They covered every surface, walls, ceiling, floor, in a branching network so fine and so complex that from a distance the stone appeared to have a texture, like fabric, rather than the smooth, polished surface that the construction records described. Up close, the individual veins were visible, dark lines, each no wider than a hair, branching and reconnecting in patterns that suggested a circulatory system or a neural network. The pattern was not random. It was structured, organized. As if the stone itself had been rewired by something that needed to process information at a density the original mineral matrix could not support. Sorvan walked to the center of the room and stood beside the pedestal. Volume 1 sat under its preservation field, its ancient binding undisturbed, its pages yellowed but intact. The preservation field hummed a small, high-pitched tone that Sorvan had always attributed to the field generator's power supply. He placed his hand on the pedestal. The stone was warm. The heartbeat was strong, not the faint, distributed pulse he had felt in the walls of the upper vault, but a deep, concentrated rhythm that felt like standing on the chest of something enormous and listening to it breathe. The pedestal was not a piece of furniture. It was a node, a junction point in the network of veins that ran through the building's foundation, a place where the organic tissue was densest, where the processing, whatever the organism was processing, was most concentrated. Volume 1 was sitting on the organism's brain, or on something that functioned like a brain. The first volume of the Tessic cartographic record, the document that had defined the galaxy's navigational knowledge for 11,000 years, was physically resting on the neural center of the thing that had been editing it. Sorvan lifted his hand from the pedestal and stepped back. The warmth from the floor followed him. It was everywhere. The entire foundation vault was warm, alive, humming with the metabolism of something that was not stone, and had not been stone for a very long time. He looked at Volume 1. The preservation field protected the volume from physical contact. No hand could reach the pages, no breath could reach the binding, but the preservation field did not protect against what was happening from below. The pedestal was part of the organism. The organism was in contact with the volume through the pedestal, through the stone, through the substrate that everything in this building rested on. The preservation field kept the pages safe from archivists. It did not keep the pages safe from the thing that had been rewriting them for 7,000 years. The thing did not need to open the volume. It did not need to hold a stylus. It did not need to enter the room. It was the room. It was the floor and the walls and the ceiling and the pedestal, and it had been reading and writing and editing the record through the stone itself, through the paper that rested on the stone, through the ink that sank into the paper that rested on the stone, for longer than the Tessic had been a spacefaring civilization. Sorvan turned and walked back up the stairs. The heartbeat receded behind him with each step, not disappearing, just diminishing, returning to the background hum he had lived with for 23 years. By the time he reached the upper vault, the vibration was once again the thing he had always mistaken for mechanical systems, the thing he had learned to ignore. He sat down at his desk. He set the desk lamp back in its mounting. The amber light pooled on the open ledger and his hands and nothing else. The humans were the archivists. The word entered his mind with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. He had not been thinking about humans. He had not been thinking about the species whose existence was most closely associated with the Forbidden Zone, the species that the fragmentary, contradictory legends said lived there, or had lived there, or had become something that the word lived no longer adequately described. But the word arrived as if the thought had been waiting in the architecture of his mind for the right moment to surface. Not the Tessic. The Tessic were the transcriptionists, the ones who wrote the entries, maintained the ledgers, preserved the physical medium. The humans were the ones who decided what the entries said. They had been doing it for 7,000 years. They had been doing it from inside the walls of the building that the Tessic had built to house the galaxy's memory, and they had been doing it so well that 40 generations of Tessic archivists had lived and worked and retired without noticing that their record was not their own. 3 had noticed, and all 3 had disappeared, not violently, not dramatically, but quietly. The way an entry disappears from a page, the way a glyph thins and sinks into the paper. Sorvan sat at his desk and thought about what Marin Dreth had written. It is not hostile. It is patient. The humans were patient. They had spent 7,000 years rewriting the galaxy's memory, one entry at a time, removing the evidence of civilizations that had existed in the sectors they now occupied, replacing history with a prohibition, replacing knowledge with fear. And they had done it not through conquest, not through war, not through any act of aggression that the galaxy's other species would recognize as a threat. They had done it through the record, through the archive, through the meticulous, patient, methodical work of editing reality at its source. The Forbidden Zone was not a weapon, it was a library. A library that the humans had built by hollowing out the Tessic's library from the inside, replacing its contents with their own version of the galaxy's history, a version in which the Forbidden Sector was empty. The civilizations that had lived there had never existed, and the humans themselves were nothing more than a vague, mythic presence at the edge of the charts. The galaxy feared the Forbidden Zone because it had been taught to fear it. The teaching had taken 2,000 years, conducted one forged entry at a time, by an intelligence that understood that the most powerful weapon is not a fleet or an army or a planet killer. It is the record that everyone trusts. And the teaching had not stopped. The false entry in tonight's ledger, the fabricated return of a survey fleet, was proof that the humans were still writing, still editing, still maintaining the version of reality that they had spent 7 millennia constructing. The erasure of the Velori, the Corvinthi, the Moth-Selin, and the Dreth Compact was not an event that had happened and ended. It was a process that was ongoing, maintained in real time, managed with the same daily attention that Sorvan gave to his own transcription work. He wondered whether the Tessic knew. Not him. Specifically, he was the 41st archivist to sit at this desk, and only 3 of his predecessors had noticed. But the Tessic as a civilization. The species that had built the archive, founded the Cartographic Council, established the tradition of record-keeping that the galaxy relied upon. Did they know, at some institutional level, some buried stratum of collective understanding, that their record was not their own? Had the knowledge existed once, generations ago, and been gradually edited out of the cultural memory, the way the Velori had been edited out of the charts, one reference at a time, one generation at a time, until the knowing became a not knowing, and the not knowing became the settled, comfortable assumption that the archive was the galaxy's most reliable institution. The Tessic identity was built on the record. Their culture, their politics, their place in the galactic community, all of it rested on the authority of the archive they maintained. If the record was not theirs, if it had never been theirs, then the Tessic identity was itself an edited document, a fiction maintained by the same organism that maintained every other fiction in the building. The Tessic were not the galaxy's record keepers. They were the galaxy's notaries, the trusted face on a document written by someone else. Sorvan picked up his stylus. He opened the current ledger to the page where the false entry had been written, the fabricated return of the survey fleet. He turned to the next blank page. And he wrote in his own hand, with the full precision of a senior archivist performing his function. Ledger update, standard navigational amendment. Beacon network along the Tessic Drenathi corridor, status nominal, no anomalies to report. The glyphs held. The ink stayed on the page. The entry was ordinary, routine, exactly the kind of thing the record expected to contain. He set the stylus down and aligned it with the edge of the ledger. He understood now what the 3 archivists before him had understood. The record was a collaboration. It had always been a collaboration. The Tessic provided the medium. The humans provided the content. The Tessic maintained the building, the ledgers, the tradition, the cultural authority that made the record trusted. The humans maintained the truth, their version of the truth, the version that the galaxy was permitted to remember. The gray sectors were not empty. They had never been empty. The Velori, the Corvinthi, the Moth-Selin, the Dreth Compact had lived there for 3,000 years, and then the humans had decided that the galaxy should forget. What had happened to those civilizations, Sorvan did not know. The record did not say. The record had been made to not say. Whether they had been destroyed, absorbed, relocated, or transformed into something the record's categories could not contain, was a question that could not be answered by an archivist working within a system designed to prevent exactly that question from being asked. There was nothing to tell that the record would permit. Sorvan walked to the archive's main entrance, the heavy stone doors at the top of the entrance stairwell, the ceremonial threshold that every archivist crossed at the beginning and end of each shift. The doors were not locked from the inside. There was no mechanism to prevent an archivist from leaving. The Tessic did not imprison their scholars. The doors opened outward onto a covered portico. beyond which lay the administrative campus of the Tessic Cartographic Authority, the city of Tesserath Ven, the spaceport, the orbital transit stations, the galaxy. He stood at the threshold with his hand on the door and felt the night air seeping through the gap between the stone slabs, cold, thin, carrying the mineral scent of the planet's high-altitude atmosphere and the distant chemical tang of the spaceport's fusion exhaust scrubbers. The sky beyond the portico was black, pinpointed with stars. The galaxy was there. He could walk into it. He could find a communication relay outside the archive systems, one that the thing in the walls did not control, and send his report to the archival council. He could speak to another living Tessic and tell them what he had found. But what had he found? The physical evidence was gone. The drill sample had reverted to stone dust. The borehole had healed. The handwriting analysis existed only in his memory. The pages he had written had been absorbed. The version history showed nothing. The environmental logs showed nothing. The communication terminal had rewritten his messages. Every piece of evidence that Sorvan had gathered over the course of the night existed in exactly one place, inside his own skull, in the neural patterns of a Tessic brain that no one else could access. He could tell them. He could stand in front of the archival council and describe what he had found: the forgeries, the erasure pattern, the heartbeat, the tissue in the stone, the organism beneath the foundation vault, and they would ask for evidence, and he would point to the archive, and the archive would contradict him. Every volume, every digital record, every environmental log, every security scan would show that the archive was functioning normally, that the record was accurate, that the foundation was basalt, that no anomalies had been detected by any system at any time. He would sound like a man who had spent too many years alone in a dark room. And there was another consideration, one that sat in his mind with the weight of the three archivists who had noticed before him. Kellan Voth, Rune Tallis, Marin Dreth. They had noticed. They had not retired. Their records had simply stopped. Sorvan did not know what had happened to them. He did not know if the thing in the walls had harmed them. Marin Dreth's final note said it is not hostile, but Marin Dreth's record had ended 11 months before a successor was appointed, and 11 months was a long time to be alone in a building that breathed. Sorvan stood at the threshold and considered the night air and the stars and the galaxy beyond the portico. Then he removed his hand from the door. He walked back down the entrance stairwell, through the administrative corridor, past the memorial wall where 40 names were carved into stone that was no longer entirely stone, and returned to his desk in the lower vault. He sat down. He was an archivist. His function was to maintain the record. The record was a collaboration, and he understood now what his role in the collaboration was: to provide the appearance of Tessic authorship, to hold the stylus, to sit at the desk, to be the living, breathing, verifiable presence that allowed the galaxy to believe the record was Tessic made and Tessic maintained. He was not the author. He was the signature. Sorvan extinguished his desk lamp. The archive sank into darkness total, absolute, the darkness of a room with no windows and no external light, deep underground, insulated by meters of stone and preservation shielding. In the darkness, the breathing was louder. The heartbeat was clearer. The composite rhythm pulsed through the stone with a steadiness that was neither menacing nor comforting, simply present. The way bedrock is present. After a time, he heard something else. A sound he had never heard in 23 years of working the night shift alone in the lower vault. A page turning. Somewhere in the darkness, in one of the sealed vaults, something was reading the record, moving through the volumes with the same careful pace Sorvan used when reviewing entries. The soft whisper of old paper against old paper, the faint creak of ancient binding adhesive. He counted the turnings. 14, 15, 16, each from a different direction, a different depth, as if multiple readers were working simultaneously in different vaults. The sound was not threatening. It was professional. The sound of archivists at work. The only difference was that he could not see them. And they had been doing it for 7,000 years. The page-turning slowed, stopped. Then, from somewhere deep in the building, from the sealed vault 3 levels below, from the place where Volume 1 sat on its pedestal in the pale blue light, a new sound. A stylus touching paper. Something was writing a new entry. Sorvan closed his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids was the same darkness that filled the archive. He breathed. The building breathed with him. The heartbeat pulsed through stone and desk and chair and stylus, and all of it beat together, and none of it was his. In the morning, the record would contain whatever it was told to contain. The digital index would mirror it. The version history would attribute it to the appropriate archivist. The environmental logs would confirm normal parameters. Everything would be consistent. Everything would be correct. And Drenal Sorvan, Senior Archivist, 41st in an unbroken line, would arrive at his desk and read the new entries and transcribe them with the same precision he had always used, and he would not question them. He would return tomorrow night, and every night until his service ended. He would write what the record permitted him to write. The humans would edit what needed editing. The galaxy would remember what it was permitted to remember. The gray sectors would remain gray. The warning seal would hold. The forbidden zone would continue to be forbidden, not because of what was inside it, but because the record of what had been inside it had been removed so thoroughly, so patiently, so precisely, that even the archivist who maintained the record could not make it say otherwise. The truth belonged to the ones in the walls. It always had. Sorvan sat in the darkness of the galaxy's memory and waited for the morning. The stylus scratched in the vault below. The heartbeat pulsed. The pages of the record accepted what they were given. And somewhere in the gray sectors of the Tessic cartographic record, the sectors that 11,000 years of meticulous documentation said were empty. Something that was not empty, that had never been empty, continued to exist in the only way that mattered. Off the record.